Our next session is about biodiversity, how we lose it, how we can act against it. And the presenting speaker has a very impressive professional history. In my opinion, he's basically one of the superheroes who's saving Kenya's wildlife. And he also is the vice president of the IUCN. Ladies and gentlemen, right before we stop talking and start acting, maybe we should just listen carefully just to be sure what to do. Please welcome on the stage, Ali Kaka.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. But first, let me begin by asking a simple question. But also, please excuse my cynicism. Maybe I'm getting tired of trying to save what is left. So I am getting a little fatigued. But the question I want to ask is, are we really losing biodiversity? Everybody says we are losing biodiversity and so on. So, and some of you even here may have some doubts about whether we are losing biodiversity. So I just wanted to show some facts. Let's get the facts right first. Look at North America, 33% loss biodiversity. And this is actually a continent that has the most advanced everything, basically. So why are they losing biodiversity, you ask? Let's go on. Europe, Central Asia, 24% loss biodiversity. And this is actually reported in reports elsewhere. So it's not my imagination. This is data from other reports as well, WWF and so on. Latin America and the Caribbean, look at that loss. You know, how much will they still have remaining in the next decade? You wonder. 94% loss of biodiversity. Africa, where I come from, with all our challenges and all the biodiversity we have and all the policies and all the efforts that NGOs and other governments put in, we still are losing 65% of our biodiversity. Asia Pacific, 45%. You see, there isn't a single region or continent that actually is registering an increase in biodiversity. Right, so there are also quotes to reflect on the loss of biodiversity. For example, nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. We have never, ever lost so much biodiversity. And it's continuing. It's not in any way stopping. And the rate of species extinction is accelerating. And this is extinction. Extinction means gone forever. That is increasing as well. And it has grave impact on the humankind all over the world. And this is going to be even more so going in the future. The report that I was quoting from, Living Planet, finds around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction as we speak today. At the rate that the loss in biodiversity will continue, we are now facing extinction of species. And I said extinction is lost forever. Whatever you have seen will be gone. Your children, your grandchildren will never see some of these animals in the future. The report, the Living Planet report, which was just last year, 2020, shows us the global biodiversity loss is at its worst, as I said. 21,000 monitored populations of mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, encompassing almost 4,000 species around the world, have declined, and this is a global scenario, 68% just between 1970 and 2016. And in the last 50 years, it's been 70% loss in biodiversity. So now we know it's actually true. Because I said this, I started by saying that, are we sure? And some people are not sure, and the impression also given by a certain sector is that no, biodiversity is not getting lost. Now let's look at some other facts as well. Population growth of humankind. It's increasing by double digits or triple digits in a lot of countries. Now, anyone, of course, remotely interested in the news will know that this is true. There isn't a single country, and I stand to be corrected here, there isn't a single country that is recording a reduction in its population. Just as I said, there isn't a single country that is recording increase in biodiversity. So here are two very important facts that I want you to keep in mind. Now let's speak about the talking part. The title said, let's stop the talk. Now here's a very big challenge, because we love to talk globally. We just love to talk, and especially conservationists. They can talk you to death, believe me. And I'm one of them, I admit. Now, in the last, I don't want to bore you with more slides, and I wanted you to pay attention to basically me talking. In just the last 5 years, let's not go back too long in history, just in the last 5 years, when there's been more talk about climate change, there's been more talk about loss of degradation, rather, of habitats, and blamed on climate change and on human development, you know, infrastructure, and so on and so on. There have been, in my calculation, and I did a very quick look at what is there have been 15 major conferences in just the last 5 years. And by major, I mean huge. People coming from all over the world, governments gathering from all over the world, talking about what? How do we save our biodiversity? So the talk is never ending. And this doesn't even include the 58 forums that I counted very quickly, organized by conservation groups. And again, I probably missed another 100 or so. But just to create a picture around all the talking that is going on out there. And of course, not including local groups that meet nationally and regionally to talk about, look at all the loss, look at everything that we are losing on the planet and in our country, what can we do, and so on and so forth. And as I said, I'm sure I'm being very conservative in my calculations. So just throw your mind out there and imagine how much more talking is actually going on out there. So why are we still losing biodiversity? You know, you should ask and you'll be forgiven for asking. At such an accelerating rate. It's not declining, it's not decreasing, it's accelerating. And all the talk that goes on what value has it really given to conserving our biodiversity? And not forgetting how much money actually is spent by conservationists, people keen on conservation and biodiversity. We are talking about billions, maybe even trillions of dollars or euros, whichever currency you want to use. And this is not an underestimation. I mean trillions. In Africa alone, in my country alone, we did a recent, very cursory look at how much money is being spent by the NGO sector, for example, in just one country. $10 billion in 1 year. Doing what? Conservation. And we have a declining rate of biodiversity as well. So you wonder whether all the talking and all the spending is actually really making a result. I don't think it is. Now let's talk about the salvation part. My opinion after 45 years in this sector really is that we are missing a very key part of the salvation of biodiversity. And if we do really pay attention, serious attention, not attention with an agenda, not attention with a self-driven motive, we may actually make a difference. I mean, this is my personal opinion. And I think what's really missing is the people component, the people aspect of conservation. And even by people, I want to qualify who I mean by people. First of all, people who own land. These are people who are vital to saving our biodiversity. And I don't mean governments. Governments mostly have huge estates of conservation areas, protected areas, and so on and so forth. But there is a large percentage of private and community-owned land that is really not factoring as well as it should be in the conservation conversation. And then people who pay the price for conserving or allowing biodiversity to survive on their land. These are also important people that I'm referring to. And then the people who have the right to decide. The people who have the right to decide what to do with their land. And then lastly, people on whose land biodiversity is found, the richness of biodiversity is found on their land, and who also have to survive. These landowners, at least where I come from, are not people who have the luxury of sitting back and watching their land stay fallow or without any returns. There has to be some use put of that land. And their decision on what to do with their land is vital in this whole aim of trying to save biodiversity. Now, where I come from, wildlife is a huge sector, and our entire tourism, or 90% of our tourism, and this is the same with, I think, all the African countries, 90% of our tourism sector depends on wildlife itself. So I will just use wildlife as an example. And I think wildlife is and will continue to face a huge challenge of space, area, where they can thrive and flourish, and especially so on our continent. This is really the key in ensuring that the wildlife biodiversity survives in the future. And the land that they also depend on is not going to be, or not going to continue to be converted to other uses as it is today. And these forms of use, range from agriculture, livestock farming, flower farming, and other non-consumptive products and human needs around the land that they own or possess. So you may ask, why does not wildlife factor as equally important in the areas that I was referring to, in Africa in particular? Of course, a number of countries have also encouraged their people to go into wildlife conservation, but principally for tourism only. For example, in SADC countries, Southern African countries, and even Eastern African countries, there has been quite a bit of conservation development around community land for tourism, particularly. But what happens then when tourism fails? And this is now a challenge that we are facing in the Southern African, Central, as well as Eastern African countries, where tourism collapsed because of the whole COVID situation. But even before that, there were challenges. Tourism is fickle. It increases one year and then completely collapses the next year because of perhaps some incident or internal conflict or some form of violence that took place. And of course, disease outbreaks. And everybody stays away. And these are the people who are supposed to be funding the tourism sector that is funding the conservation of wildlife on their land. So you can see, simply depending on one source of income or revenue for the conservation aim of that biodiversity is a failure in most countries that I can speak of, that I have knowledge about. And again, going back to the landowners, these landowners must see consistent worth or value of their land. Otherwise, they'll move on to something else, and it is their right to do so. And so we must look at multiple forms of benefit of these landowners to ensure that they take an interest, a consistent interest, to sustain conserving the biodiversity on their land. Otherwise, it's just going to be a cat and mouse game, and you can give as much money as you want to have them conserve, but still, the consistency, the sustainability factor is not really a definite in the whole equation. So wildlife itself must have an intrinsic value to the landowner if it's going to survive on there. Other forms of biodiversity also must have some value, economic value, if the conservation on that land is going to be sustained. It's as simple as that. It's not a romantic thing to say. It's not a good thing to say that, why should biodiversity have economic value? But these are facts. If I'm a landowner, if you're a landowner, and if you don't have billions inherited, you will want some value from that land. If not from what is there, you move on to something else. And this is not an imagination. This is fact. It's reality that is facing most of the countries, at least where I come from. I don't believe we have the luxury of allowing really and entertaining these romantic and sentimental notions that are thrown around in most of these talk shops. That's what I call them, where they haven't really resulted in real success in saving our biodiversity, because they give all these romantic notions that, oh, you must just conserve for the sake of humanity. You must conserve for the sake of your children, and so on. It's nice, it's flowery, maybe it makes you sleep better. But for the landowner, this is not reality. It has to be different. Let me now turn briefly to nations and peoples that are also guilty of over-harvesting, and even sometimes if it means doing so illegally. This is something that I really emphasize, and it must be addressed, because harvesting, using natural resources is one thing for economic value, but when you now go beyond sustainable use through illegal trade, through your own greed, again, you are posing an equal danger to the loss of biodiversity. We must learn really to curb our needs and demands as people or as human beings on dependency on biodiversity and natural resources, and in my case in particular, wildlife products. You know, we must control, as I said, the use of these natural resources. And we must stop doing so illegally. This has become a really huge problem in our continent. There's far too much illegal trade of natural resources by greedy, I don't want to say countries, but certain people who would go to any extent to get what they want, which actually is a part of the ecosystem, and the loss of it disturbs or destabilizes ecosystems. So illegal trade really is something that we have to jointly put a stop together completely. I still believe we can sustain biodiversity. Call me foolish, but I still think we can turn things around. And I did mention this very important aspect of the landowner getting economic value out of their land. And of course, we must also limit how much we want to use from natural resources. And finally, it's the people. I go back to what I said, the people who should be central to the decision-making and not others. There has been a tendency of certain sectors in the environmental conservation world who think they know best, who think they know better, forgetting those people, and I think I've already defined who I mean by the people, that they actually will make the difference on whether we are going to turn this tide around or not. So let me just stop there. Thank you very much.